Okay, I think we're going to get started. Welcome everyone to today's event, Access as Convenience, Tracing Russophone Vocabularies of Disability Access from the late Soviet period to the 2010s with Cassandra Hartblay from the University of Toronto. My name is Eugene Reichel. I'm the director of the Center for East European and Russian Eurasian Studies here at the University of Chicago. This event is also sponsored by the Department of Comparative Human Development and the Posen Family Center for Human Rights, with generous support as well from the U.S. Department of Education Title VI National Center Resource Grants. So there'll be time for questions at the end of the event. For those of you here in person, we'll also have some lunch. And to our virtual audience, you can add your question anytime to the Q&A box, and you can also upvote preferred questions. To our in-person audience, I just want to say, I'd like to ask you to wait for a microphone before asking your questions so that our Zoom audience can also hear your questions. And now I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Michelle Friedner, who will introduce our speaker.
Cool. Well, thank you all for coming. It's very nice to be able to introduce my colleague and friend, Cassandra Hartblay. Dr. Hartblay received her PhD in 2015 from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I'm reading from your bio. Yeah. And she is a sociocultural medical anthropologist working in a variety of media and performance formats. She's currently an assistant professor at the University of Toronto, Scarborough, based in the Department of Health and Society. And she is also an affiliate faculty member and a member of the Anthropology department. One of Cassandra Hartblay's most notable accomplishments is the fact that she started a Center for Global Disability Studies at the University of Toronto. And in doing that, she really worked through massive bureaucratic hurdles and did a lot of wonderful work to do that. So I'm really excited about that. And another thing that Cassandra has done is she wrote a performance ethnography. She's well known for experimenting with different genres of writing and doing anthropology. And her first book, titled I Was Never Alone, was based on ethnographic fieldwork on the life experiences of people with mobility and speech impairments in Russia. And the book has been supported by fellowships and positions at UC San Diego and at Yale. So prior to starting at the University of Toronto, Cassandra was a postdoc at Yale, and prior to that, she was a postdoc at UC San Diego as well. So she's been in a wide range of institutions, and she has been teaching disability studies, anthropology, and feminist and gender studies in all of these locations. So it's really my pleasure to invite Cassandra to give a talk, and thank you so much for being here.
I don't think I keep talking.
What do I do with the microphone?
I'll take it. Thank you, Eugene and Michelle, for inviting me and arranging this event. It's really a pleasure to get to share research with you all today. Thank you to Esther and Matt for arranging the tech side of things, to the Center for Eastern European and Russian Eurasian Studies and the other sponsors of the talk. Thanks also to our captioner for the day. So please let me know if I'm speaking too quickly for the captions. And also thank you to those of you who have made time to attend today. It's lovely to see you, those of you who are here in person, and I look forward to hearing from those of you who are joining on Zoom, although as I'm speaking, I won't know who you are, but I'll find out later. So my talk for today is titled Access as Convenience, Tracing Russophone Vocabularies of Disability Access from the Late Soviet Period to the 2010s. I'm just learning how to use this. I don't think it's on.
Let me see. I might have to,
Maybe a battery thing.
yeah.
Could-
It says
or maybe-
it's working.
Okay, so it is moving. Maybe I just didn't have it on. All right. So I'll start with an ethnographic vignette to situate us. There we go. On the slide is a map of the northwest region of Russia. And I was there in the fall of 2012, conducting field work, and I befriended a journalist. He was about my age, late 20s at the time, and he had a distinctive personality around the small city, for both because he had a dark red hair that was kind of an unusual color, and he had this very gleeful enthusiasm for investigative human interest journalism and the trappings of the vibrant public sphere that he imagined journalism to offer. This was a political moment at the start of what I now think of as Putin's reconsolidation of power, when the Russian foreign agent laws had just come into place and were squeezing the myriad local nonprofits that had professionalized in the first 2 decades of the post-Soviet period, returning civic life to the provenance of state organs. And while some so-called foreign political discourses, especially feminism and LGBTQ rights, as with the Pussy Riot debacle, were really under fire in Russian public discourse that fall, I noticed that disability access didn't seem to attract the same sort of political scrutiny or controversy. So despite this moment of political crackdown, the journalist, unlike many other young people I met in the city, was still optimistic. And while we didn't meet often, he sometimes invited me to interesting public events around town. And I sometimes wrote him private messages on social media or via text to inquire about public opinion on a general issue I was curious about. But I came to know him first through one of his investigative pieces when a friend sent me a link. I had arrived in the city with the intention of studying disability advocacy. As a graduate student in anthropology at the time, with a background in disability advocacy in the US and several years of student exchange programs in Russia under my belt, I had this idea that there might be something specific about the post-Soviet way of thinking about disability and social inclusion that might contribute to the ethnography of post-socialism in general and offer some insights about political subjectivity of that moment, while also offering a different historical and cultural context to debates in disability studies. Slide, please. Okay. So here's a screenshot from the video. In the video investigation produced by the journalist and his colleague, a news camera operator, he followed a tip from some local disability advocates that despite renovations to the historical provincial theater building in the city center, it was still exceedingly difficult to navigate the venue in a wheelchair. So going for a Web 2.0 style of entertainment news, the journalist decided that rather than produce another story interviewing disabled citizens, of which there were several at that time, he would obtain a wheelchair and try for himself. Or so he explained to me when we met for coffee later. In the clip, he sits in a borrowed wheelchair and attempts to get from a small vehicle parked nearby, up the curb, up the front entrance ramp, and into the theater. Now, the piece is problematic from the perspective of North American disability studies in that the journalist possessed none of the lived experience, arm strength, and expertise that comes from navigating a wheelchair regularly. And so his repeated failures to navigate barriers in the built environment come as no surprise. But charming as he was, the piece still managed to be entertaining. And at the end of the clip, he moved on from the theater to try to gain entry to a city bus. In this clip, the ableist barriers of the transit system are more apparent, as one bus driver simply drove off when he asked for help getting on board, and then another is shown struggling to assist him to get through the bus's door. When I interviewed the journalist, he admitted that he knew very little about disability issues in the city. He had decided to do the clip because he thought it would make good content, and because the issues of barriers was a good example of a bigger problem. That is, the lack of follow through on the part of the city, provincial, and federal government that claimed to be attending to disability access issues, for instance, by renovating the theater and also by ratifying the UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled People. but obviously without any care for the end result in terms of convenience and usability for actual citizens with disabilities. I was puzzled by this interview. I couldn't quite fit the story I had imagined that I wanted to tell in with the story the journalist had told me. How could I write an ethnography of disability advocacy that completely left out disabled people, as his story had? What could I make of the way that the journalist mobilized barriers to disability access in the built environment as a sort of metaphor or vehicle to make a larger point? Slide, please. Thanks, Esther. So here's an overview of the talk. With this opening vignette in mind, let me share where we'll go from here. First, I'll connect this story of the journalist's in-access video to some of the big picture questions that motivate my work on this topic and contextualize my fieldwork. Then I'll step back to review how the concept of disability access travels globally and what's at stake. Then I'll dive back into the ethnography to share more examples of access stories in daily life in the city, Petrozavodsk, in the 2010s. And in analyzing this, consider the specific vocabularies that my interlocutors used to talk about disability access. Next, I'll analyze and contextualize these vocabularies, and especially discuss the stakes of the claims about inconvenience in the Soviet and post-Soviet context in Russia before concluding. Slide, please. I'm going to give up. It's okay. So in my book project currently underway, an ethnographic monograph, I observed that the idea of disability accessibility proliferated in Russia in the 2010s. And following Anna Singh's idea of global friction and the broader anthropological discourse on how ideas travel, I find that the concept of disability access spread and became more commonplace in Russian life, not only because it fit neatly into a need of actually disabled people, but also because of certain mismatches or strange misfits in the way that the idea entered public discourse. In this way, the book traces two discourses of disability access in contemporary Russia, which I came to realize amounted to different styles of what I call in-access stories that I heard during my fieldwork. The first kind of in-access story that I recognized is one that might feel familiar to North American audiences. This is a kind of in-access story rooted in what I call disability expertise. Stories that disabled advocates tell themselves, each other, others about grotesquely familiar scenarios of access measures that don't work, often shot through with sardonic humor, sometimes followed in response to my earnest questions with musings about what it might take to address problems of inaccessible infrastructure in their city. In contrast, a second kind of in-access story that I kept stumbling on during my fieldwork and subsequently through continued analysis of broader public media discourse are in-access stories that use disability access as a metaphor for the broader failures of the Russian state to make good on the promises of public infrastructure, to deliver a degree of ease and convenience for everyday people. That is, as I spent time with my ethnographic data, shared it and received feedback, this second kind of in-access story started to take shape as an important narrative form, where at first I dismissed it as not quote unquote about disability. I recently have come to think of the way that in-access stories circulate without disabled people on a different scale of discourse as perhaps somehow important to broader considerations of political subjectivity. I returned to in-access stories like the journalist's approach to the inaccessible theater, not as isolated examples, but rather as one iteration of this broader public discourse in which claims about failed disability access infrastructure were held up by non-disabled Russians as a way of obliquely making a broader political critique. While initially I had imagined that these examples might come from disabled people using an assimilationist strategy to call for better accessible infrastructure, I actually found few examples of that iteration in my ethnographic archive. And so while I had initially resisted the idea of thinking of disability access as a metaphor for something else, a habit that those of you who are disability studies scholars will recognize as something that's often maligned as a way of reproducing ableist tropes, eventually I realized that as an ethnographer, I had to describe the world as it is, and the way that it was reflected as a situation in which the concept of disability access or inaccess was spreading in Russia in the early 2010s, and not only by disability activists, but also as a metaphor. So I observe in my monograph in progress that the concept of disability access is traveling in friction in Anna Singh's terms. That is, the mismatch in meaning to different stakeholders is actually part of what propels the concept's dissemination. So in the rest of my time with you today, I want to pursue this consideration by tracing a combination of ethnographic examples and historical research. In doing so, I will argue that the idea of dostupnost, or access in Russian, is conceptually linked to the concept of convenience, udobstvo, especially in the way that the Russian state's intervention or abdication of responsibility is linked or spoken about in terms of the material structures of the built environment. My consideration of this uneasy confluence across translated categories comes from analyzing ethnographic interviews with interlocutors with mobility impairments. First, I observed that in response to questions about dostupnost, access, my interlocutors sometimes use the word udobno, conveniently, to describe a quality or attribute of a structure, passage, or space. Initially, I imagined that this word, along with other attributes or Russophone terms like spokojna, meaning peaceful, or normalna, meaning normal or not bad, were used to talk about the translated concept of disability access in a way that might be just loose synonyms that fit more easily into colloquial speech. But later, in conducting supplemental research in newspaper archives with my collaborator, Gyuzel Kamalova, we found that the word udobno sometimes appeared in oblique references to mobility, impairment, and the built environment in major Soviet newspapers Pravda and Izvestiia between the 1940s and the late 1980s. And our article on that topic is currently under review with Slavic Review. What I'm interested in today is thinking through a subsequent problem that this line of reasoning has raised for me, which is to consider what problems or limits the category of convenience raises politically for disability access, and whether suggesting that convenience is an attribute of access might weaken the political stakes, or conversely, root it in Soviet logics of justice. But by this I mean that the everyday Marxism of Soviet life led to common refrains drawn from historical materialism, including, for instance, a phrase recently highlighted by anthropologist of post-socialist architecture, Mikhail Moravsky, that is, "Бытие определяет сознание," or "being determines consciousness." That is, the material world creates the conditions that develop political subjectivity. If the proletariat lives in squalor and is constantly surrounded by uncultured material surrounds, the infrastructural base, the socialist political consciousness will not develop. And at the same time, it is the responsibility of the state or party to produce the material infrastructure that might foster socialist consciousness. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So let me back up, describe briefly my fieldwork and what is at stake in thinking of disability access as a global concept. Then I will share some examples of how ethnographic interlocutors describe convenience and access in similar terms and contrast these with historical uses. This allows us to then think through more fully the stakes of inaccess and inconvenience as concepts for making political claims. And finally, I hope this will bring me back to thinking about my journalist friends' use of inaccessible infrastructure as a rhetoric of complaint. Slide, please. So moving on to this question of how disability access travels globally. The concept of an accessible built environment, dostupная среда in Russian, is one that has been disseminated widely across cultures and national boundaries by disability advocacy communities. Following this usage, the word access itself has come to have a particular meaning in relation to mobility disability in the built environment, specifically the ways in which design affords or precludes movement through space and therefore participation in social and political life. How am I doing on captions? The notion of disability access, thus structured, derives from social movements in the United Kingdom, where the advent of the social model of disability in the 1980s argued that disability comes from barriers created by society, not from individual bodies, and thereby created a new political rhetoric adapted to the minority rights argument of the American disability rights movement. And incidentally, those were all Marxists creating the initial social model, right? As disability studies historians have shown, the lobby for accessible design standards can be traced back into the 20th century in North America before things we now recognize as belonging to that category, like wheelchair ramps, door buttons, and curb cuts, were codified into building codes, professional practice, and legal codes. While some advocates worked locally and nationally to advocate for these changes, others were working transnationally, planning summits, visits, and exchanges between disabled people around the world, and advocating for global bodies such as the UN and the WHO to adopt social and environmental models of disability in their policies. Thus, while disability studies scholars have always recognized the limits of a so-called universal design to truly create universal access, and the conundrums created by exporting what disability anthropologists Benedict Ingstad and Susan White call the Euro-American model of disability, understanding disability access as a global movement for justice and human rights, as well as a sphere of professional architectural and design practice, continued its transnational export since the early 1980s. Therefore, I understand disability access as one, a conceptual tool mobilized by disabled people and their allies in advocacy towards social inclusion. Two, as a domain of practice and the variety of practices therein that further that goal. And three, I consider the structural aesthetics or visual party in architectural terms of disability access as a symbolic domain for the material expression of modern statehood, or an object image that can be mobilized by metaphor. And while accessible design speaks to a variety of kinds of disability, in this project and the talk today, I am largely referring to work with a group of interlocutors with mobility and speech impairments, and so I have mostly focused on mobility access. It's a certain kind of problem that mobility access stands for and overshadows other kinds of access, but that's a talk for another day. Slide, please. So now I'll share some ethnographic content that will help us get into the ways people were talking about access and convenience. On a Wednesday in October 2012, I walked 3/4 of a mile down the hill toward the lake, along the busy city blocks to a repurposed kindergarten where the art therapy group met. The group gathered in the room there are people around my age in their 20s and early 30s. 3 of those present are professionals, the social workers and psychologists who facilitate the program. The other 8 are people with disabilities, unemployed. The bright colored van has made its way through the city, picking up those who use wheelchairs. 2 of the group members, Svetlana and Max, who walk, came by bus. Inside the building, Bacchus is waiting for someone to take off his coat, while one of the social workers helps Alina, seated in her wheelchair, to remove her hat, gloves, and coat. Bacchus, I ask, when he shuffles over to me and gestures that I should give him a hand. You can't do it yourself? Of course he can't, tut-tuts the psychologist, upset that I would present him with such a question. His brain injury has left him with limited mobility. Bacchus and I smile at each other. We're both at the mercy of medical facts and professional expertise. He is an invalid, a person with a disability, and I am a foreigner and outsider. This scene unfolded as part of an art therapy project for unemployed adults with disabilities that I was lucky to be invited to, and through which I met several people who became key interlocutors, as well as joining the group partway through their season for weekly arts activities, from drawing to performing a recital of Pushkin poetry. As a visiting ethnographer, I was welcomed into the fold by the group members for the novelty factor, our American. Slide, please. So here's a photo of some of the interlocutors in one of the city's few accessible vans on their way home from group. The art therapy group was funded by a federal grant dispersed through a local organization, and the project's facilitators were charged with implementing the program. But although the social workers are the impetus for the meetings, they are really the newcomers to the group. A core contingent of the art therapy group, Alina, Bacchus, and Sergei, have been the target of social programming for invalidi in Petrozavodsk since childhood. Growing up in the 1990s, they were often grouped together. Alina and Sergei were born with cerebral palsy. Bacchus was hit by a car and suffered a traumatic brain injury when he was 9 that left him with limited mobility and slow speech. So although their respective parents had little in common in terms of profession, background, and hobbies, they were all struggling with making sense of how to obtain services and support children with significant disabilities in the crisis climate of the 1990s. Over the years, the families have come to know one another and a rotating cast of NGO workers and other professionals, local or international, working in social service programming in the city. So through interviews and participant observation, I heard the in-access stories of the interlocutors that I met through this group. Subsequently, through a colleague at a local university, I was introduced by email to Artyom, a university student with cerebral palsy. And everybody here is referred to using a pseudonym. So Artyom and I met on an early spring day in 2013 when there was still drifted snow along the sidewalks. The sky was a low gray, and the cafe was not far from the city's Eternal Flame Monument. We had a cup of tea and a pastry and talked, and Artyom suggested a walk, moving along the sidewalk using aluminum crutches with plastic arm braces. Later, I came across the transcript of our audio recorded interview that day. When I searched my ethnographic archive for some key terms, I noticed that there were certain terms that were often used alongside the word dostupno or dostupnost, accessible or access in Russian. And my search brought me to the transcript, particularly a section in which Artyom observed that he is walking in the city or boarding a bus. Quote, I need to consider every act and consider the possibilities, consider how I go about things so that it will be more convenient, udobnie, for me. He was responding to a question about access in his family's apartment, which he explained was a 5th floor walk-up. The staircase was particularly difficult during the long process of gaining strength following a procedure that left his leg in a cast. It was in the context of this larger in-access story that he considered convenience. Slide, please. Thank you. Oh, no slides. That's okay. I can talk without it.
Okay, it'll be up in a second.
Okay. So let's take a minute. So in his longer quote, he says, after the cast came off, you can imagine it was difficult. For half a month, my legs wouldn't flex because they had been in the cast. And then you start to work them, basically physical therapy, pain, a whole lot of tears, and then it gets better. At first, you won't be able to do anything at all. Then you'll have to have worked out something about your system and you start to walk. And then it starts to come to you more quickly. Then you can go downstairs only holding on with one hand, but you always put down a crutch. Before it was only sideways, holding on with 2 hands and going pretty slowly. Now I can go down either with or without a railing, just with my legs and my crutches. Then the next phase is public transit, trolleybus, buses. Not many people understand, but for me, I need to consider every act and consider the possibilities. How will it be more convenient for me? And he goes on to also use the word normalna in the same quote. So in this interview segment, Artyom describes the progress he made in terms of growing ability to move through the city as he gained strength and skill walking with a metal crutch following a surgery. A journey that began with small movements in his family apartment slowly expanded to include the stairwell, then the street, and finally the city's old and difficult to enter buses and trolley buses. The structure of the built environment, particularly the fact that his family's apartment is on the 5th floor, creates a disabling structure. Reflecting on his experience working up to riding public transportation on his own, essential for attending university in the city, he described the degree to which a particular manner of doing something would be convenient for him. In this construction, convenience approaches a semantic conceptual realm similar to that of disability access. Artyom could have used the word dostupny, the direct translation of accessible, with the comparative adjective dostupnie, but that's kind of a bit of an awkward word, and he opts for the more colloquial udobnie. I'm going to jump ahead a bit. So Artyom's use of this synonym was part of a wider pattern of discursive engagement with the idea of disability access observed across interviews with several interlocutors. In addition to udobno, other attributes of access, including normalna, komfortna, spokojna, were also used by interlocutors with mobility impairment to discuss experience of inaccess. His use of the comparative adjective and others' frequent reference to experiences that are more or less accessible. Accessibility functions here as a relative concept established via comparison. And I have a little chart. Could you go to the next slide, please? Thanks. I don't know if you can see it, but basically what I did was kind of do a little ethnographic thing where I thought about the conceptual domain of accessibility in public space. Then I listed some of the terms that I noticed people using. Dostupni, оборудован, безбарьерная среда. We could go on. And then I did a second chart that is, this is kind of a James Spradley thing, where you list the attributes, the words that are used to describe the attributes of the domain. So here, these are a conceptual domain that is experiences of mobility access or attributes of what makes something accessible, according to people when they're talking about the concept of access. So here, that's how I'm really thinking about these words, udobno, комфортно, спокойно, нормально. We can think of them as attributes of this global concept of disability access. So when someone's describing an accessible pathway, they might use, I can freely go from here to there. I can peacefully go from here to there. So that's a big separate project, but what I'm really curious about today is this idea of udobno. So can we go to the next slide, please? So the problem that comes up for me here with the word udobno or convenience is it seems to carry a sentiment related to the concept of disability access. On the surface in English, although the practical usage of convenience and accessible overlap, only accessible has been designated as the term that applies to political advocacy concerning the attributes of the built environment to prevent or enable the social and political participation of disabled people. And particularly in English, the word convenience tends toward the trivial or inconsequential. When we speak of convenience, we refer to quotidian concerns, errands, whether to get out of the car at the bank or use a drive-through ATM machine, whether to take another route on a commute that requires fewer transfers or fewer turns but takes 5 minutes longer, if a movie theater tends to have long wait times or not, if excess energy will be expended on hassle, bureaucracy, distance, or waiting. Indeed, the definition of convenient in English includes this idiomatic usage convenient to, meaning close to or within easy distance of. And there's a similar construction in Russian. So, I mean, this is kind of an aside, but it suggests a possible affinity between the idea of convenience and crypt time. So when we ask whose access is prioritized in English, we are considering a design bias for non-disabled users, but we might also ask whose convenience is prioritized, which also gets at that assumption of privilege. However, when we're contrasting access with convenience in English, it prevents a possibly troubling slippage for disability advocacy, which is that the comparison suggests a reading of access as attending to those needs required for participation, while convenience suggests something that would be nice, right? It's not required. It suggests labor performed by someone else to prioritize the time, ease, and comfort of others. So indeed, when accessibility accommodations are misread as requests for convenience, they're often maligned, as many of us in university settings can attest. Furthermore, as my colleague Larissa Kurtovic pointed out, convenience in English tends to suggest an experience of something that's already been laid out. There's a sort of passiveness to the way that we think about convenience and appreciation for something that already exists, whereas access tends to carry a connotation of equity and advocacy. But I started to suspect that these attributes adhere, like the way that they adhere to these near synonyms of access and convenience in English isn't necessarily the same in Russian. So in order to think through this relationship, I have started to conduct a etymological survey of Russian dictionaries and English-Russian dictionaries published over the course of the 20th century. I'm definitely still working through this comparison, but what stands out at first blush is that the term udobstva, which is kind of the bigger concept related to the word udobno, convenience, is especially connected to concepts of desirable living spaces and the idea of modern accommodations. In Soviet terms, this often meant public heating, hot water, indoor plumbing, and toilets. Another Soviet word for this is blagostroystvo. that describes the well-appointed modern apartments widely used in mid-century Soviet life. So again, getting at the necessities of the everyday being and therefore being that defines consciousness. So meanwhile, this connotation of public infrastructure in most of the Soviet period dictionaries I consulted, I can find the word access and dostupnost. Obviously, the Soviet dictionaries predate the internationalization of global disability access as a concept. So we're not going to find a connection to disability there. But because it carries this deep connection to the idea of renovating lived environments and home spaces, there's something interesting going on there. Okay, could we go forward? Actually, 2 slides, please. That's just some screenshots of a dictionary. Okay, so I want to think about this in terms of inconvenience as a kind of Soviet political claim. And we're getting close to the end. So in her ethnographic account of what she calls unraveling professional journalism in Russia in the 1990s and early 2000s, Natalia Rudakova studied how working journalists conducted and understood their work in the newsroom of regional Russian newspapers. She demonstrates that their sense of duty to offer voice to public sentiment was rooted in a Soviet journalistic ethos that also sought to represent a vox populi, so much as was possible in an era of pervasive censorship, and then through the opening of the glasnost period. In her chapter on the ethics and politics of Soviet journalism, Rudakova especially devotes attention to the genre of letters to the editor. She argues that in spite of the pervasive censorship that made direct consideration of certain topics impossible, an ethic in the sense of unfolding practices of truth-telling and truth-seeking guided journalistic practice in the late Soviet period. I'm going to skip a little joke that I wanted to relate when I was reading her book. But Rudakova argues that in the beginning of the Soviet era, Bolsheviks placed an important emphasis on soliciting citizen complaints, grievances, and suggestions as quote unquote popular control from below. This drew on the practice of complaint that peasants brought to regional authorities in the pre-Soviet imperial times, which Mariana Muraeva has written compellingly about the timbre of those complaints. And while this role of the citizen as eyes and ears of the state in the Soviet era was understood as essential to building socialism, according to Rudakova, it's most famously known in the West as this informant culture of neighbors and family members spying on one another, whistleblowing, and so on. But in these regional newspapers that Rudakova studies, there's a lot of whistleblowing about complaints about the misuse of funds, abuse of power, and we also see this in historian Sheila Fitzpatrick's work about the Stalinist period. Rudakova argues, therefore, that Soviet journalists had a duty and obligation to participate in governing by airing complaints that served as surveillance from below. She asserts that while much of the Soviet press was indeed devoid of capacity to speak truth to power, quote, in the back pages of newspapers, particularly in the long-term commentary essays called achorki, as well as in reviews of reader letters, the courage of the writer was pushing the limits of what was sayable, end quote. So in this light, my journalist friend's video expose on the lack of access, the purportedly accessible regional theater building, this looks less like pandering to the global or the foreign or inostronia interests by invoking this global discourse of disability access, and more like a genre of reportage that takes seriously a duty to air the pervasive issues of Potemkin villages, false facades, and unfulfilled promises. Rudakova gives numerous examples of these genres in the late Soviet period and the truth-seeking effects that they held. And in our own study of the major Soviet newspapers, Izvestiia and Pravda, Gyuzel Kamalova and I found numerous examples of oblique references to physical disability in relation to design, construction, or maintenance of infrastructure in the built environment. So for instance, in the immediate period after the Second World War, calling for a special section of the banya or bathhouse in St. Petersburg to accommodate the war-wounded veterans, or many articles about the housing needs of aging war veterans who have, although they don't say it, they might say the word invalidi or disabled. What is totally silent, though, interestingly, is any mention of the polio epidemic, except the epidemic in the US. So that's very interesting, given the polio epidemic being a major impetus for access in the US. Okay, so there's an example, for instance, of a veteran who is, he's given an apartment. It's a convenient, beautifully constructed modern apartment, but it's on a hill, and he's complaining, why can't I be given an apartment where I don't have to walk up or down a hill to get to the bus stop? Okay, so slide, please. So why has disability access as an ideology become so sticky in Russia today? Why was disability access speakable of a paradigm of critique in the post-Soviet Russia of the 2010s, unlike these nominally progressive causes in the West, demonized as anti-Russian by Putin's elites? What I want to suggest here is that there's something important about the way that claims about disability access constitute claims about a state's failure to produce minimum standards of infrastructure for normal life or convenience, and thereby the establishment of an imagined political sphere of society that draws on these longstanding ethical norms. First, the idea that because бытие определяет сознание, or being determines consciousness, insufficient infrastructure is emblematic of a society that does not strive to improve or build a political consciousness that allows citizens to imagine a better future. And second, the notion that a public complaint about inconvenience is a kind of duty and should be aired. In this way, convenience as a paradigm, udobstvo, might be considered a more political concept than access or dostupnost in Russian discourse. So in making this argument, I'm following others such as Sarah Phillips and Claire Shaw in suggesting that the theoretical and topical lens of disability studies offers another entry point to considering post-socialist political subjectivity. Moreover, in making this argument, I'm interested in the implication that there's something special about the way that disability access as a paradigm was circulating in this public discourse in Russia in the 2010s. So whereas identity-based minority rights movements popular in Euro-American liberal politics tended to be constructed in dominant Russian discourse as foreign, especially LGBTQ rights and feminism, disability access seems to be treated differently. It seems to have this affinity with this longstanding way of talking about convenience. So essentially what I'm saying is that there's this relationship between convenience in terms of the built environment and claims about inaccessible infrastructure that allow it to adhere to an endemic discourse that is not only about what the state owes to citizens, but also about the significance of infrastructure as an indicator of what a healthy society and the promise of a political imaginary of a livable future might offer. And so just to wrap up for today, it seems obvious that studying disability can tell us something about disabled people's lives and forms of disability expertise when we compare that, for instance, with queer theory, we haven't really seen disability theory circulate as a tool for thinking about social phenomena in general. And so that's part of what my project here and my new project going forward is about. I want to suggest that disability anthropology approaches to etymology of language for and about disability access lends another tool to area studies research on political subjectivities of post-socialism. And that also gives us a way into talking to disability studies and the suggestion that there may be more nuance to endemic vocabularies of disability access than the global rhetoric that moves in friction suggests. So returning to our journalist at last, I want to suggest that his attention to the inaccessibility of the built environment was both about the specificity of injustice faced by disabled people and at the same time about the failure of infrastructure in general, depicted through imagery of inconvenience of moving through the city, heightened by the hyper-focus of the inconvenience that his borrowed wheelchair produced as a prop. His performance of inaccess thereby underlies the ways in which the discourse of disability access moves in friction as a term with different but generative stakes for different political actors. And I also want to give a shout out to my University of Toronto colleagues, Hannah Quinn, Vanessa Maloney, Miggy Esteban, Julie Moreau, and Shana Yee for their comments on an earlier version of this talk.
Thank you. For questions right now. Does anybody?
Can you turn the microphone on?
Yeah.
Should be a green light.
Now I think it's on. Yeah, thank you. Sorry. I just wanted to open up the questions. Does anybody in the audience have questions? Yes. Would you please say your name and perhaps your affiliation as well?
Hi, thank you for this talk. My name is Elena and I'm a history PhD student. I have two questions, one of which was prompted by the chart of the words and some of their English translations. And I was struck by the fact that one of the translations for normalno is also in the European style or European way. And I'm curious if you can comment on that. My second question is prompted a little bit by some of the work that has been done on the eugenics movement in Nazi Germany, where there was a close association with being categorized as disabled and being unable to work. And certain ability to work, perform menial tasks, saved some people from euthanasia and sent them towards sterilization. So that's the historical background. I don't want to draw any comparisons to this later period, but I am curious how you see the linkage between ability to work and some of these other discourses around convenience and access.
Yeah. That's really important. Thank you for that question, both of them. So yes, I didn't explain the charts in great detail, but what I noticed when I was analyzing how people use the word normalna is that in this particular period, especially in reference to infrastructure and the built environment or kind of standards of middle-class life, right? People frequently use the word normalna just to say it's fine, it's good, but it also indexes this kind of imagined modernity that that the speaker is implying exists elsewhere, but not in Russia, right? This kind of like constant self-deprecation of like our pathetic Russian situation, right? And I'm not the one sort of saying this. This is like what my interlocutors are saying to me, right? I'm not maligning Russian infrastructure myself. So yeah, it is I think that is thanks for picking up on that. I didn't write it into this talk, but when I was thinking about how infrastructure was related to access, that usage of normalna was really important kind of hinge point. And then thanks for bringing up the question about eugenics and particularly the ability to work, or I've written about this in terms of productivity in Russia, and I'm not a historian, so my analysis may not live up to kind of, it's not working with archives, right? It's more working with secondary sources. But what I've argued in an article in Disability Studies Quarterly about this is that there's a sort of way of thinking about productivity that is shared actually by modernist states in the 20th century. And so that for all of the emphasis on differences between a communist and a capitalist system, in fact, from the moment of Lenin initially said, from each according to his need to each according to his ability, or from each according to his ability to each according to his need. But then subsequently that was revised by the party in order for, they basically said, we can't do that right now because we have to catch up with the capitalist world or else we will be crushed. So we need to suspend this socialist ideal. And the new standard will be from each according to his contribution, to each according to his contribution, rather. And so that created a drive for productivity and this kind of idea of productivism in terms of both glorifying udarniki or like shock workers, and then also in terms of thinking through how can we put injured veterans back to work, especially after the Second World War. And there's quite a bit of historical texts about veterans movements in the Soviet Union. So yeah, I think it is really important, and definitely the hinge point around institutionalization outside of a family home. And there's a fair amount of discourse in the late Soviet period and the post-war period about how to adapt work environments to veterans who are missing limbs and things like that. Yeah, thank you for that question.
The questions? Yeah. And please introduce yourself.
Thank you. Thank you for the talk. This is great. So my name is Misha. I'm also a historian, like Elena. And considering you just said that you're not a historian, this might be a little bit of an unfair sort of prompt. But I am actually really interested, or was super interested in what you were saying about the etymology of the word convenience, how it refers back to sort of notions of everyday life. And actually specifically, not just everyday life, but also apartments, renovations, right? These sort of infrastructure where one lives. And it made me think about the mostly late socialist, but broadly socialist conceptions of a good life. And so I was wondering whether you could speak a little bit to, and my sort of historian sort of prompt there is, it seems like your talk suggests continuities in sort of notions of not only in political claims, but also in sort of notions of the terms and its associated sort of valence of the terms of convenience, right? And again, sort of continuity in the ways in which people see what the state or claim vis-a-vis the state. So I was wondering whether you could speak a little bit to this, whether you see continuities, whether something's different maybe in the 2010s, or whether sort of going back to at the beginning, I guess, what you said about notions of social justice and the ways in which the Russian context might be a little different. So yeah, so these notions of a good life and how people make claims and notions of continuities. Sorry, this was a little rambling, but I hope it made a little bit sense.
It makes perfect sense, and it really reminds me of there's a linguistic anthropologist, Christina Fehoveri, whose work about Hungarian late socialist good life in terms of like the design and outfitting of family apartments and consumer goods is like very much about this late Soviet idea of a good life. Of course, it's a different location, so I didn't want to rely on it too heavily here, but it's definitely in my mind as I'm doing this work. And in the book project, I have a whole chapter where people are talking about their home spaces and what they find accessible or inaccessible. Some of them say, my home is the only place where everything is accessible to me. So it's like a little, respite. And then others experience it as kind of that feeling of frustration of wanting to be able to go out more than they're actually able to, depending on the family's resources. Financial resources really help in that situation.
But wait, sorry, just point of clarification. Do they say it's accessible or do they say it's convenient?
Well, I mean, it's so interesting because it's so hard to parse, because I often asked questions where I use the word dostupny, where I use the word access as the way to open the conversation, right? But other times people would just be talking about, as I mentioned, I sort of trained in the Spradley method of ethnography, and his big number one question you ask your interlocutors is, can you describe a typical day from the morning you wake up to the morning you go to bed at night? And so I actually ended up hearing a lot of, finding a lot of the description of what the home space is like for interlocutors versus outside of the home in that question, right? Because people would describe also the kind of emotional way that they thought about my typical day. Are they thinking about it as something that frustrates them, or are they thinking about it as this is my life, right? And it was very different for different interlocutors, if that makes sense. Yeah, it's mixed. They use both terms essentially, but I would suggest that the dostupny is a little bit more formal. It's more like something you would read in a newspaper, and convenient is more conversational. Of course, they're talking to me, who they know as a foreigner and who is someone who understands like disability access discourse, so they know that they can use both modalities. So yeah, it's not one or the other. I don't know if I answered your question, Misha. Yeah. No, I like that. And you also use the word valences, which I think is a good way to talk about how these domains are kind of overlapping and intersecting, but not precisely congruous. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Can I be heard? Am I okay? Okay. I'm Mackenzie. I'm also an historian. Sorry. I guess I have sort of a question relating to your third kind of property of the understanding of kind of the built environment and its relationship to disability, in particular, the question about the state. And I was interested in whether you have observed or thought about connections between critiques of the state and other things beyond disability. For instance, architecture as representative of the state's policies toward, homelessness or poverty or things like that, and how that might interface with the kind of framework that you brought for us.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I think as an ethnographer, I'm drawing that third definition where I'm talking about it being emblematic of, there are these kind of images of access that are in access that circulate. And in my larger project, I describe a lot of memes that circulated on the Russian internet that are just these images of inaccessible light ramps, or you might all remember the Sochi Olympics and the two toilets in one room, and how Russians and Americans alike were making fun of the failure of Russian society, but also the state to produce the infrastructure they imagined. And so, drawing on that analysis of this kind of, I guess you could say, digital culture kind of style of relating to these images, I'm sort of suggesting that images of inaccess are circulating not only about disabled people or because disabled people are promoting them, but they're getting reshared by non-disabled people, and they're getting reshared to kind of suggest this bigger social problem. So that's kind of like another chapter of the same story that I'm telling here. Because this project was mostly ethnography about disability, I didn't look specifically at homelessness or poverty, but I think that would be a good angle to investigate. I'm thinking of an ethnography called "Needed by Nobody" by Tova Hojestrand, I believe, although I might be mispronouncing that name since I'm not looking at it. And yeah, there's definitely something there about what spaces, what presence of unhoused people are doing to public space. That's interesting. Yeah, and also I mentioned Mikhail Moravsky. He just had an article come out in American Ethnologist where he talks about the new Zaryadka Park in central Moscow and how it's kind of an example of this grand but also false facade of pleasantness in the center of Moscow. But I would love more historical examples.
We have an online question from Jihao Lin. Jihao says, "Thank you for this great talk, Cassandra. I wonder if you want to elaborate on the professionals' power, especially journalists, in shaping the discourses of convenience. How are journalists different or the same from other professionals like urban planners or engineers who prefer to use the frame of access?"
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't thought about it before, so it could be something to kind of draw out in this further. I had kept writing this opening anecdote for this talk and then taking it out and then writing and then taking it out. And I think I finally found the paradigm that I need to explain it with what I've shared with you today. And I think, in another article I've written about an interlocutor who's a civil engineer and how she thinks about checklists around access in her work. So it would be something to think through. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Yeah, I think journalists do have quite a bit of power in terms of deciding which stories to elevate. And I definitely knew several journalists in the city where I was doing my fieldwork who were doing interviews with parents who were complaining about some aspect of inclusive education in the city. There was a major civil rights case around the right to inclusive education in the city, right when I was starting my fieldwork. And then it was very interesting that what ended up happening is that even though they won the civil case, parents still ended up sending their kids to the specialized school simply because the mainstream schools were not accessible and were not, basically if your child was like a wheelchair user who needed an aid, a one-to-one aid, they wouldn't pay for the aid. You had to pay for it yourself as your family or as a mother, essentially. Not a father, although that, that was not ever brought up, but, some mothers did, they tried it for a year and they acted as the one-to-one aid for their kid in the public school. So that's what I thought this project was going to be about. And then when I went back after preliminary fieldwork, everybody was like, oh my God, we're done with that. We give up. We're just trying to improve state services now because we can see that's what the future is going to be. So it's quite interesting in that regard. But that's a little off topic. Thank you for the question, Gyuzel.
Other questions? Oh, Matt, yeah. Not a historian.
Sociologist. Sorry. So my name's Matt. I'm a PhD candidate in sociology and social work, and so this may, not being an anthropologist and working in the U.S., this may not be a useful question. But I was really struck by your description of the rhetorics of convenience really coming about as a way of talking about the convenience of that which is provided by the state and as a way of, kind of state surveillance from below. And just in thinking about the contrast you were drawing between that and the sort of more Anglo-American concept of convenience, is the US language of convenience often more focused on the market and consumer goods? And is that part of perhaps why it has less power and less kind of sense of seriousness or gravity? Again, sorry, US sociologist trying to look at this through some of what I've forgotten.
No, Matt, thank you for that. I think that's a really great insight. And now I want to look at convenience in marketing, right? It's so interesting, when I think about designed consumer goods, there's always these examples of OXO, the brand that cares about how convenient it is for someone who has arthritis in their hands. And there's this, widespread tale about the OXO can opener because the designer's wife had early arthritis or something like that. So I think that's really astute. And it is kind of, I think as an anthropologist, I tend to try to avoid explanatory models, right? But I think it could be, part of the cultural context in which the concept of convenience emerges differently. And I think you're right, to think that in the US, when we're talking about convenience of, for instance, a public bus system, the public discourse is so fraught because we have this butting of heads between those who think a public bus system should be defunded and doesn't need to exist at all, and those who think that it should serve everyone and be convenient. And so the terms of our debates about publicly produced convenience are so deeply different from a Soviet and post-Soviet context, just because of the difference in the sort of premise of the idea of public infrastructure. But at the same time, there's a sort of imagined modernity to public infrastructure that I think carries across both. And In the chapter in the book, I also talk about campaigns to complain about potholes in the city as like another valence in which people are complaining about like our roads are terrible. And it kind of shows another framework in which we have this idea of ease of motion and mobility through public space that is not precisely disability, but some of the same logics get applied to.
Right. Interesting. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for that observation, though. That's really important.
Any other questions? Are there other questions from the audience online? No? I have a question then about an access story. This is Michelle Friedner. I'm an anthropologist. And so the question is about, so why call them inaccess stories then, as opposed to inconvenience stories? And then I wonder too about the social life of convenience. So just thinking about what Misha was asking earlier about the good life and the role of convenience and pursuing a good everyday life. I guess I wonder about, what does convenience do socially in terms of bringing people together or mobilizing people, and what does it do effectively for people on the ground as well? And then the third question is, what do your disabled interlocutors think about this journalist's work and the work of non-disabled people to invoke disability as a metaphor?
Yeah, great questions. Yeah, so why not inconvenient stories? I think that's a good point. I think it could be a way to kind of really ground the argument in the ethnographic concept and kind of start from the beginning with this conundrum. So I'll definitely think about that. I think, I was writing, well, you've seen the draft introduction to the book, but I think I was writing from the idea that I was writing for North American disability studies audiences, right? So I wanted to give a term that could travel and do work on its own for other disability studies scholars. And I think an access story as a genre of speech act is a really useful thing that we can like hang this whole genre on, right? Like we recognize the genre when it happens. We tell it with humor. We tell it with that kind of wink, wink, nudge, nudge way. If you're part of disability culture, you feel at ease inside of an inaccess story as a genre of speech, right? Like someone starts telling you about some atrocious, unbelievable inaccess thing that happened to them. And there's a whole set of effective and sort of ritualized ways that we respond to inaccess stories. So I think I was thinking about offering that term as something that can travel beyond this particular work. But I think it's a good point that if I want to really demonstrate like the kind of specificity of the context, that also calling it or suggesting that it could also be called an inconvenience story gives it that local specificity. So I think it's that challenge between the local and the global in terms of strategizing about what to do with the text. But thanks for that. I'll think about it. Yes. So your second point was about the social life of convenience, both in relation to the idea of the good life or like a kind of ideal that we're imagining, but then also what does it do socially in terms of bringing people together? I think that's a great question. And I think when I wrote about this in my dissertation version of this, before I had kind of like rethought it and revised it, I was imagining, as I kind of suggested, that this was an assimilationist strategy, that disability activists were using this like broader public discourse of like how people complain about potholes as a kind of rhetorical genre of complaint, like a rhetoric of complaint that access can kind of slot neatly into and thus slide under the radar as not as overtly political as other kinds of minority rights claims, right? And that's what I initially argued. But then as I went back and like reanalyzed my data, I realized that it was actually, there were so many more of examples of it coming from this public discourse than from disabled people themselves, that I couldn't actually make that claim that it was an attempt at an explanation, but it didn't ultimately fit the data. And so now I think that these claims about convenience are very close to claims about corruption, right? Functionally in societies. So in my article in American Ethnologist, the editor very strongly suggested that I might want to add a few paragraphs about corruption, even though I hadn't been thinking in terms of corruption, because I'm often suspicious of calling Russia corrupt because it's an old argument that can feel very flat. But what I found is that the anthropology of corruption is actually very rich, especially in India. And so, looking at that literature in terms of thinking about how making claims about corruption, it does things. It gives people a way to critique governance and government and make claims about poverty that can be very useful, and also building affinities. So that might be something to think about further that I haven't thought about yet here in terms of convenience. Yeah, and then your last question about like, what do disabled interlocutors think about these big picture questions? It's one of those things that, like, when you bring something to your interlocutor and you're like, hey, did you see this on the internet? And they're like, yeah. Like, there's no there. They're like, yes, I know that exists, right? But like, what is there to say, right? Like, there wasn't like a really strong critique of it, right? People were just like, yeah, that's a way that people, they're like, yeah, that's a real problem, right? These meme images of inaccessible ramps. Maybe it's something that's worth going back to interlocutors to talk about. I definitely, when I, went back and did a follow-up trip, asked people, what do you think of my claim that, there's all of these images of inaccessibility circulating. People didn't have a lot to say about it. Like, mostly what they then would start talking about would be more personal, right? So
that's also really interesting too, like the different scales on which these conversations take place and the ways that some disabled people might not feel that they're part of this as a larger conversation, or that the larger conversation is not about them per se.
Yeah. And I think that, there's a real cleavage amongst my interlocutors, which if you've read my first book, like, it's really clear that some of them are activists and some of them are just themselves who are people, right? Who happen to have a disability. And that decision to move into an activist consciousness, I think, is like the cleavage point between when they would launch into a monologue about the corruption of the city and the fact that this train station hasn't been renovated or hadn't been renovated at that point, right? So it really depended on their kind of like how they understood disability as a political issue or not.
But do you think that, sorry if I'm, no, but do you think that saying that something is inconvenient is inherently not a political claim, or do you think that it is?
What's interesting is that, like, it can be a political claim, right? Like, if you think about the post office in the United States, for instance, right? We had 30 years of people complaining that the post office was inconvenient. The post office responded and made many more convenient ways to buy stamps and like mail letters. And then the Trump administration attempted to defund it because they said it provided a subpar service, which is essentially a suggestion that it's inconvenient and that a for-profit enterprise provides a more convenient service. So I think we can certainly argue that convenience is a valence of the political in North American discourse also. I don't know. someone else can do that project for me because I just need to tell my interlocutors stories. But I think, I think it's worth exploring if we take seriously this suggestion that it's worth thinking about, the suggestion that I'm making, that it's worth thinking about different vocabularies for talking about disability and access, and like thinking through the different political possibilities that those different vocabularies might allow. Like what if there's an alternate timeline where and now I want to find out, like I've been thinking about this ever since I started this, writing this talk, is who was the person who decided, there was a group of disability activists somewhere who decided we're going to use the word access. That's the word we're going to use. And there's an alternate timeline where they chose convenience in English, maybe in the multiverse. But what would have happened? I don't know. And what possible political potentials exist? If we all, as access continues to get hollowed out and corrupted, is it actually perhaps more of a personal request that could be recognized in a different way to say, oh, that's really inconvenient for me. Would you just mind doing it this way instead? Has anybody said that? I don't know. That would be interesting to think about. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. I think you're going to tell me later.
We can continue the in-person conversation, but perhaps we should
wrap
let
up.
our virtual audience go, and we can continue discussing over sandwiches. So.
Oh, thank you. Thanks everyone for coming. I appreciate it. It's wonderful questions.